Welcome to those who are new to the second last Malaysian Research Insider session. And to those who have joined us last Saturday, welcome back. My name is Apple, and I'll be your host for today and doing my PhD in University of Edinburgh. So this science chat is co-organized by MBIOS, 100 Scientists of Malaysia, and our media partner, Science Media Centre Malaysia, Josh. And let's welcome Josh today. He's doing a PhD in Cognitive Neuroscience in University of Nottingham, UK. And he's also one of the co-founders of 100 Scientists of Malaysia. So it's nice to speak to him about his research, as well as his journey in 100 Scientists of Malaysia and how Sarah, Anthony, and Josh found it and where they're going next. So Josh investigates how the brain uses error signals to help make adjustments to our behavior. So over to you, Josh.
Right, thanks, Apple. Very nice to be doing this session and sharing what I know about the work I do. So this is a brief backbone of the structure of the talk I'm gonna give just to help guide me. So I'll talk a little bit about my background, where I came from, how I ended up here, and my area of interest, why I'm interested in cognitive neuroscience and the particular PhD that I do. A bit of my side hustle, which Apple has alluded to already, is 100 Scientists of Malaysia. And lastly, I'd like to leave quite a little bit of time for questions, so you can ask me anything about psychology, neuroscience, 100 Scientists of Malaysia, or anything at all that is appropriate. Cool. So I went to a secondary school in Malaysia, normal SMK. So I just a neighborhood school basically. Live in Puchong, and basically those are my very formative years. I enjoyed my time there. Played around a little bit, and these two pictures here show me in the crowd. I'm here and somewhere in the crowd there. So this is when we are performing choral speaking. I'm not sure they still do that in school, but it's basically you get a script, right? Someone wrote a script that tells a story or whatnot, and you kind of perform it as kind of like a choir. So you basically speak the script. I mean, it's somewhere between speaking it and singing it. So that point was to get your COCO points, that kind of thing. So that's what I did in high school. Then I went on to Methodist College KL, MCKL, to do my A-levels. And that is where I discovered that I enjoyed psychology. The classes were really nice. I liked the subject very much more than any other subjects that I took. But the disappointing thing was psychology was actually my worst subject at A-levels out of the other subjects that I took. So I took physics, chemistry, maths, and psychology. I did most poorly in psychology. The very first exam that we took, I got a C. And then I decided, C is not gonna cut it. I'm gonna retake the paper. And I retook the paper and I got a D. So it was kind of, I don't know. I don't know how I think about it, but yeah, psychology was my poorest subject in A-levels, but I ended up here doing psychology instead because I enjoyed it and I had fun doing it. And then I originally had intended to do law before I discovered that I like psychology in A-levels. And I was fortunate enough to get a tuition fee scholarship. I was for my bachelor's degree. So I received the Star Education Fund Award to do my BSc in psychology in the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. At the time, I also had the opportunity to do an exchange year. So in my second year, I spent a year in the University of Nottingham, the UK, which is where I'm currently at doing my PhD as well. So that is where I got basically before this point, I mean, it was quite late into my degree that I realized that, yeah, maybe I want to go the science route, maybe do a PhD or whatnot, do a bit more research kind of thing. Yeah, before that, I had absolutely no clue that that was a career option, and it wasn't something that I even considered before I entered uni. So yeah, which comes to say, things can change as you go along this journey. Yeah, with psychology, a lot of students start off wanting to become clinical psychologists, and things, you know, be open-minded to how things can change and lead you to onto different paths. Yeah, so that is all I want to say on my background, and I'd like to turn into what I actually am interested academically. So what the field I study is called cognitive neuroscience. So neuroscience meaning science of the brain, cognitive meaning studies about cognition. So what are the brain processes that give rise to the things we do, the actions we take, the decisions we make, all these kind of things. So it could be, it is a series of like a lot of different areas that falls under cognitive neuroscience. So part of this is a big part. These are the more major subjects within cognitive neuroscience. So we have perception and action. So perception deals with all our sensory percepts. How do we see? How does vision come about in the brain? How do we control our bodily movements? How do we hear? That kind of thing. So this is in the first things that happen in the brain, right? Like perception and action. The next thing that is very big as well is learning and decision making. How we learn and adapt our responses. How do we make good? How do we decide what is good, what is bad? That kind of thing. And then language. Language is a big part. How do we end up understanding language? How do we generate speech? How do we understand written text? This is somewhat very interesting to think about. Like, it is one of the processes that are more uniquely human than everything else. And then there's other fields like memory. Memory is a big part of psychology. Why do you remember certain things and not other things? Is why is forgetting sometimes even useful? And then more closely to what I do is attention and cognitive control. So how you attend to things, how you sustain attention, what is the correct right things to attend, and all that. So, and there are other subfields like social neuroscience, which deals with the neuroscience of like person-to-person interaction. How do I infer what you are thinking? And developmental neuroscience, looking at the development of brains and all these abilities as you grow up. So a lot of these abilities, like for learning and decision making, memory, cognitive control, they mature really around, say, in your 20s and early 30s, and then it goes up and then it goes downhill from there, but with a lot of individual variability, of course. And then there's affective neuroscience, which deals with how you process emotions, how emotions get signaled in the brain, and all of that. Yeah. So the point of this slide is cognitive neuroscience is very varied. There's a lot of subfields that you can go into, and what I do is only a small chunk of it. And a lot of cognitive neuroscience, if you ask a person who studies one area, they would have very little clue. I mean, not very little clue. Like, they will be less knowledgeable about the other aspects. Cool. And yeah, so what is cognitive control? So it's like one of those jargony words, right? That if you've not come across in this field, it's somewhat of a thing that is, scares people, like, ooh, cognitive control. But basically, it's not mind control, but it's just a concoction of different abilities that we've decided is important abilities that support and adaptive goal-directed decision making. So it supports decision making. It supports you achieving your goals, and it's classed as a higher level cognitive process, meaning it happens it's something that requires more, is developed later on, as compared to some of the earlier processes such as vision and audition and those sensory things. So some of the things I've listed here is like cognitive flexibility and task switching. So your ability to switch between tasks, working memory, the ability to hold and remember information in your mind so you can manipulate it. For example, mental arithmetics and that kind of thing. So attention. So when we do everything, our attention span is usually fairly limited to just a small scope. And how do you then decide what is where the attention goes throughout, right? I could be attending to what I'm saying. I could be attending to my surroundings. Of all the things that you're experiencing now, there's only a limited amount that you can attend to. How do you shift that focus? And also, like, how do you inhibit things that are distracting, things that are not relevant to what's going on now? For example, if there was a bell ringing, an alarm that is maybe a false alarm, I would say, like, or some things that maybe white noise that is just in the background, and it's not relevant to what you're doing now. Maybe you're trying to focus and read a book. You shouldn't be attending to the noise. So these are part of what we call cognitive control as well. And the thing about cognitive control is that it's a very good capacity, but is very, very easily overloaded. So some of the examples that we've found is that if I ask you to attend to the central arrow and then I ask you to respond quickly, what is the direction of the arrow in the center? The correct answer is left, but because of the distracting arrows by the side, if you have to do it very quickly, you're likely to get it wrong because the other flanking arrows are distracting. So this loads our cognitive control capacities, and as well as things like this, right? So if I asked you to name the color of the ink that was printed, the correct answer is yellow, but because it's printed orange, there's a competing representation. It overlaps with the dimension of the color of the ink. Therefore, it is somewhat more difficult to say the correct thing. So yeah, it's an expensive process, kind of like if you think about like real estate and like where should you allocate your resources. It doesn't make sense to keep your cognitive control on all the time. So there should be triggers, right? Triggers of when you should turn it on and when you should turn it off. A lot of processes we do in daily life are, if you have read this book called Thinking Fast and Slow, it goes between system 1 and system 2. System 1 is the more automatic things you go about, things that you are familiar with already. You make not much choice on, it's not as deliberate as system 2 where you make intentional choices. So how do you shift between system 1 and system 2 that the book talks about? So how do you switch between thinking fast to thinking slow? So one of the things that are more automatic is, say, for example, when you're eating and whatnot. So this is a picture of me eating an ice cream. It's not something that you have to think about or plan or do anything deliberate, but things like this can happen. So if you're not careful or anything like that, you could just accidentally drop your ice cream and there goes your day, right? You just be ruined. You somewhat get shocked a little bit, like, I dropped my ice cream. There goes the thing. You view over it, and how do you learn from this experience in order to adapt? And how do you adapt from this, right? In order to not repeat the same mistake the next time. And this is another example that is somewhat similar as well. This was given by someone who replied to a post on the 100 Scientists of Malaysia. So she gave this example of the mistake that she made. So in the morning, you going to wash your face, and then you without thinking much, you reach for the toothpaste instead of the facial cleanser. This is one of the mistakes that can happen because it's automatic and deliberate. But so we're trying to look at what processes might support learning from these kind of mistakes in order not to repeat them, because these seem, especially if they're very ingrained habits, it's harder to change these things. So where will we start to look at this question? So we know that there is an area in the brain, like there's a network in the brain that signals errors. So in this cluster here of the brain, you can see it's the posterior medial frontal cortex. It's just somewhere around the midline of your brain in the front of your brain. So this area signals errors, and it's just one of those things that signals an error has occurred even if you don't have conscious awareness of it sometimes. So you don't have to be it can sometimes just be something that occurs below your conscious awareness. There's still sometimes is an identifiable signal. We think that this is one of those things that initiates cognitive control. It signals that you have to do something about it now, and as a result of that, you can implement an adaptive response towards it, an error. So we think that this is an important signal, and it should be taken up as to lead to other processes such as better memory, better learning, maybe you make your actions more deliberate, that kind of thing. So yeah, and there are multiple ways of looking at learning and errors. So one of these ways of learning is, take this example, what I call here error-free learning. So to learn the pairing between so you want to learn that dragonfly is paired with crickets, dogs is paired with bears, ladybug is paired with bee. So you can present a list where you present all these pairings and to tell them the correct answer to things so that they learn without making errors what is the correct thing that should be paired together. So this is just an example. Or you could present such a list and you make the learner guess what would be paired together. So you just make a wild guess. It doesn't have to be informed even, and you make these kind of choices. And as you can see, some of these pairs are the wrong pair. Say for example, ladybug is supposed to be paired with bees, but in this case, the learner guessed that it's paired with apple, which is wrong. And in this case, you go on to tell them, oh, ladybug should be paired with bees, not apples. And what they found is that in these two types of learning conditions, if you learn just the correct set of pairing without having to even just make a wild guess at what it's meant to be paired at, when you test the memory of the pairing later, you can see that in the error-free condition, performance is somewhat less in each of these experiments than it would be if you tested it with the people who've undergone the learning with just making a wild guess at what the pair is. So error generating seems to have an effect on subsequent learning. And the other way of thinking about errors is prediction errors, which if you've followed Alea's talk earlier, it's something that is grounded in this framework of learning we call the reinforcement learning, which it might be familiar with people who do some machine learning or or whatnot. So this idea that we learn through prediction errors. So what are prediction errors? Don't get scared by these two formulas. I'll show you what it means. So it's just the difference between expected reward and actual reward. Say you go to McDonald's, for example, you want to order a burger, and in your head you have this picture of how the burger is McBurger. Yeah, you have the picture. It's advertised like this, but when you actually order it and the order is delivered, it looks like this. So this is one of the instances that you generate a negative prediction errors. You expected more, but the actual reward is less. So you get a prediction errors. You should learn the next time when you go to McDonald's that you should really be expecting a burger that looks like this rather than a burger that looks like this. Then you have the opposite scenario. You expect a burger that looks like this, but if it turns out to be better than your expectation, it looks more gourmet, you should generate a positive prediction errors. You should learn that, going to this restaurant gives me better burgers if I went to McDonald's. Therefore, I should adapt my expectations accordingly. So these are just instantiations of like the prediction error formula that I've been given here, and it's what a lot of it's a useful framework to think about how we learn from rewards. And yeah, so a lot of psychology, you can see things that seem to suggest rewards are the ones that are driving learning. But intrinsic to the reward framework, there is things like the prediction errors. Errors are central to learning. And we can see that in terms of cognitive controls and errors, there is a suggestions that point towards cognitive control and errors being impaired in patients with like depression, schizophrenia. It impairs these kind of cognitive processes. So now I reached this point in the thing where I shift my focus away from what I do towards the tools available for cognitive neuroscience in general. So if Apple, you can pull up the poll. So yeah, I don't see the poll, but I'd like to focus in of fMRI as a tool available in cognitive neurosciences because that's the tool that I'm more familiar with. Aside from fMRI, there is methods such as EEG, MEG, which is the setup in the middle here. This is an MEG where you, this is super cooled conducting. So there's some liquid helium within this bit, and then when you super cooled helium, it creates a very sensitive magnetic field that you could detect this magnetic field around your head. So this is one method of studying cognitive neuroscience. There are also other methods such as brain stimulation. This is a TMS setup. So what happens is in this coil, there's an electric current going through this, and then out comes a magnetic field perpendicular to the coil. And yeah, so so what it does is the magnetic field interferes with the electric fields in your brain, and it makes the neurons more excitable or less excitable.
And Josh, there's some poll results already.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So what does it say? What's the most?
I think 62% of the people said the fMRI measures the electrical activity generated by synchronized neurons.
Oh, okay. So that's the first answer, and 62% of people selected that. Mm-hmm. That is where that trick in SPM that they tell you if the answer is the longest, you take that one. You fall prey to that because that's not the right answer. The answer is actually fMRI studies blood oxygenation in the brain. So the first answer, which is measures the electrical impulses of synchronous electrical activity in the scalp of a population of neurons, so thousands of neurons. This is in the field of, this is what is measured by EEG, MEG. So what you do is you have electrodes on top that measures the electric field that it can be detected on the scalp. And if you have a lot of recordings, you can average them and you get one of these waves that you can then compare between one experiment setting and another experiment setting. So that's how you get the difference. And say, for example, in this particular plot, you see the feedback related, error related negativity, where you see a deflection when the person's committed an error, as opposed to when the person doesn't commit an error in the blue line. So that is the electric fields. fMRI is a technique that is a bit different. So it's a different measuring method that measures blood oxygenation. So some of people might have experienced taking not fMRI, MRI scan for particular medical procedures to probe inside your body. This is fMRI, which operates similarly, but instead of taking this one snapshot like this, you take multiple snapshots over time. And what you do is, as you taking these pictures, you can look at the blood oxygenation change within different regions of the brain. And the idea is that if you have more oxygen uptake in a particular area, that means that area is active. But there are strengths and weaknesses to each of these methodologies. For example, in fMRI, because it's oxygen uptake, right? It's a slower process as compared to like electrical impulses. So as a result, your temporal resolution becomes much blurrer. It is not as sensitive to small changes. Only changes that are persist are detected over longer time frame in the order of seconds, as opposed to EEG, MEG, which is on the order of milliseconds. The deflection is sensitive to the orders of like 100, 200 milliseconds.
That's pretty cool. I got a question. Like, I mean, the EEG looks like really scary, but the brain stimulation, like when you actually stimulate using electrical fields, like do you feel anything? Like,
yes, you feel a small tick. Some people feel a small tick. It's somewhat annoying at the start, but because with all these experiments and everything, it is conducted in a safe environment. We make sure that it's not going to harm anybody. At least we for it's been tested to only, you're only meant to give a certain range, so it's not meant to be it's meant to be safe. So what happens is you would feel a tick, small pulse, which sometimes go away. There are sometimes reported side effects like nausea, which is unfortunate and should be avoided. But yeah, if it answers your question, it does have a slight sensation.
In your brain, you mean in your head, that you can feel a pulse?
Oh no, there's no receptors within the brain. So there's no pain receptors or touch or this kind of thing within the brain. But what you feel is the sensation in the scalp.
I see.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yep. So of the few answers, the third one, which is the shortest answer, is the answer to the poll. So that is one of the techniques that is available to us as cognitive neuroscience. But the caveat is that these tools are quite costly. For example, fMRI to operate the scanner, it incurs quite a huge cost. This setup MEG as well, it's expensive also because in both cases you have to supercool the liquid or maintain the magnetic fields. EEG is somewhat more cheaper, but it's the machine itself is expensive as well. But to use it, there's not much cost as compared to the other methods available. And PMS is relatively more economical compared to the other tools as well. Yep. So you can feel free to ask me more questions about cognitive neuroscience or any neuroscience in general or psychology in the questions. But I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about 100 Scientists of Malaysia. This is an initiative I've started with Anthony and Sarah. And I guess quite a bit of people in the audience have heard about it already. But if you haven't, we started this project just over a year ago, trying to increase the diversity of people in STEM, increase public exposure of the work we do to the general public, because we felt that being a scientist or doing science is not something that is in the public awareness very much, especially not for Malaysians to be doing it. So like growing up, we didn't have role models for that looked like us or are people like us, right? And we thought, yeah, maybe we should do something about it. And then we started 100 Scientists of Malaysia as a platform over a year ago to feature scientists, to get to know people who's doing interesting science. And we had quite some good response. So we started out as a social media platform, but we're gradually moving on to doing other things as well, like physical events. What's in the works is we have got collaborations to run science placements. Hopefully will take shape, is taking shape and will maybe run sometime in the next year. So this is some of the things that we think could help encourage people to go into STEM. And the other thing that we are also looking at is expanding, and we recruited some team members to join the group. So if you're interested in what we do and the things that might come out of it, do let us know, and keep out for and being checked and see what comes out of this, basically. And yeah, that brings me to the end of my talk. Basically, there's just 2 points that I'd like to share. If you want to be a scientist, you just have to work at it. There's a lot of hurdles that could be crossed. A lot of it is, trying to seek opportunities and whatnot and see where it brings you. It's not easy, but you can do it. For a person who had no awareness that this is even a possible career option or thing to do in life. Yeah, I think if we grow this awareness to more people might be interested in such a career. The second point is, there's a whistle-stop tour of cognitive neuroscience. It's such a broad field, and I only work on a very small bit of cognitive neuroscience. But the thing is, with psychology and cognition, you can see a lot of things lead into each other and blend with each other. So the work I do is not just on cognitive control. It goes around like things like learning and memory, decision making. So yeah, you could, if you're interested in these kind of topics and subjects, feel free to explore a bit more on this topic. And yeah, this is when talk about errors. This is somewhat of the mistake that has been hyped up. To make egg fried rice, you shouldn't use a colander. You should use a wok. Yeah, this is another mistake, and I think it's so in your awareness that you would not make this mistake again. Yeah. So thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Anthony. I like the colander reference. So, like touching on the colander reference, right? Does it matter whether there's like the severity of the error on how you stop making the mistake, next time? Is that a correlation?
Yes. Yeah. So there are errors that are somewhat expected sometimes, or some just you're taking a bit more risk, or then there are errors who are somewhat more unexpected. So for example, in the 2 examples I point out, like dropping the ice cream on the floor or using toothpaste as face wash, these are things that are somewhat more unexpected. When it comes as somewhat of a like, ooh, shock. So these tend to be corrected a bit more. There's also errors that are, so sometimes you commit an error with high confidence. Sometimes it create, say for example, you always thought that, say for example, Kelantan is above Terengganu, and then someone told you it's actually otherwise, and then showed you evidence of it. So these, you've always been very confident, but now someone has and then you found information and evidence that, oh, it is indeed the other way around. These are things that get corrected a bit more efficiently. So this is called the hyper-correction effect. So not all errors are equal, and there are errors that are harder to change, harder to correct. Some just get brushed off.
Yeah. So like we all know someone who never learned from their mistakes. Is that I was just thinking, is that a biological reason for that, or like is acknowledgement of mistakes an important factor as well? Because like you can people can just tell you that you're wrong, but you have to acknowledge that you're wrong. So yeah.
So mistakes that are harder to correct goes into a special realm. Like for example, habits. Habits are things that are more difficult to change. And there are, I mean, so in the audience, we have Alea, and then there's one of our colleagues as well, Sunwei. Oh, Sunwei is on here as well. So this is maybe something that Sunwei addresses in his work. He looks at how habits can be changed in might be changed but in substance use dependence. But yeah, so it's a bit more tricky, and it goes into the realm of, because for something like cocaine dependence, it's as a substance, is so rewarding when you have it. So it is very, very ingrained in you. The reward is so strong that to want to undo it is somewhat a bit more difficult, because it's, yeah, so it's something that is currently being researched on, how come some habits are so difficult to change.
I was just curious, do you also look into physiological changes? When someone recognizes an error, sometimes you get like probably some hormonal changes like during that short span of time.
Yeah, so a lot of now there's a bit more movement towards like doing other sorts of physiological recordings. So some people look at pulses, right? When you commit an error, sometimes maybe your pulse increase. There's also people who use eye tracking methodologies. So very, very efficient cameras that track your eye movements, and as well as your pupil dilations, how big your pupil dilates. These are index of like how alert a person is as well. So these are some of the physiological things that can be measured and used to study errors and cognitive control.
Cool. Yeah. So there's a question from Anthony, your housemate. What do you think is the relationship between learning from mistakes and resilience, which is like our post-traumatic growth?
Yeah. Take a moment to understand this question a little bit more. Learning and mistakes and resilience. So yeah, there you can think of instances where mistakes are not learned, and as a result, you don't quite adapt to it. Like sometimes it's not even the awareness of the error, it doesn't even arise. So sometimes it might be because of that no adaptation is performed in the no adaptations happen. But there's a lot of individual differences between like people, and why some people seem to adapt pretty well, some people have not. So there's a lot of this is something that is a bit more hard to study experimentally, because everyone comes from a different experience. And so we in my line of work, I typically, because I use like we use experiments to look within an individual what happens when they commit a mistakes and versus they don't commit a mistakes, whether they adapt to it or whether they don't adapt to it. So this happens within one person. So like, for example, if you look at resilience and post-traumatic growth, it's usually looking at between people. So it's different methods of studying things.
Cool. A question by Alea. Do you know if anxiety, clinical or otherwise, hinders one from effectively learning from mistakes, especially when the feedback is, a punishment?
Yeah, I haven't been very into like different the literature review on this particular thing, but what we can see is in anxiety, there's attentional bias. You're biased towards negative information as well. And then there's some suggestions of error sensitivity. So different clinical groups have different levels of error sensitivity, for example. Say, for example, how they appraise the feedback, whether maybe how they appraise the feedback is somewhat different from the general population. So it is tied to like and it is tied to things like attentional biases. I haven't looked into like the more neural mechanisms of like whether some sort of like functional connectivity is perturbed between the cognitive control network or whatnot. But effective appraisal is where I start looking at if I want to make the link between anxiety and learning from mistakes.
Yeah. Cool. Sabrina asks, how do you think we can apply understanding learning from errors in teaching?
Yeah, very quick thing. Thanks for asking that as well. So so in the past, right, there's a lot of emphasis on positive reinforcement. So the idea that you reinforce good behaviors all the time, and then say, for example, and then you at all costs avoid making mistakes. But what we know now is that errors contribute as well. And the example that you've seen before that I pointed out between errorless learning and error generating. In some cases, when you just learn what is the correct pair, your learning is not going to be enhanced as opposed to if you had incorporated some errors. So the other thing that people who study memory would tell you is that testing is very important in learning. So if you just learn by rote learning or whatnot, without actually testing yourself, that is not going to be as effective as just studying the material. So testing is somewhat important as well. And if you do a bit of teaching, that is what I suggest is something that is very important to implement.
Yeah, cool. I was just thinking like your upbringing or when you were a child, your upbringing does your family background, your cultural values and things like that does really affect how you learn from your errors as well. So I don't know if like there's any research into that, because that's quite a complicated thing to look into, I would say.
I haven't actually saw a lot of any literature that looks at say, for example, cross-cultural error awareness or how you appraise errors. That might be interesting.
It's quite interesting because like obviously there's quite a big difference between Asian and Western cultures and how we deal with errors or how we see errors. And cool. So can you share with us some real-world applications of cognitive neuroscience in general?
So when we think about cognitive neuroscience, right, we're thinking about how the brain functions. And then there is a big bit of it is how that function is disturbed. And a lot of times when we see, say, for example, a psychological condition, say, for example, depression and anxiety, schizophrenia, these can be thought of as disturbance to the normal brain function, neurotypical function. So it's very easily translatable across to there. And a lot of neuroscience is, trying to it seems that it's going towards the route of like, say, how can we be create machines that are biologically inspired, and one day create robots that are, this is further down the line, I would say. But I mean, when they're developing those things, they kind of try to draw experiences from findings from neuroscience and all that.
Cool. So like robots that learn from their mistakes. That's quite cool.
I mean, it's very easy to program. I mean, somewhat more easy, I guess, to
false or true or something like that. Yeah. So, what are some career prospects of cognitive neuroscience? Like, what if you do cognitive neuroscience research? Like, what do you go on to do after as a job?
If you, well, if you know any opportunities, let us know as well, because we are looking for opportunities as well. But yes, opportunities for cognitive neuroscience. This is something that we should definitely acknowledge, right? Like, positions in academia is not going to exponentially increase, and you know, it's a very competitive field. So a lot of what you can do with this kind of training, after, if you don't eventually practice in cognitive neuroscience, is that some of the more transferable skills, like the hard technical skills, like for example coding, programming, data analysis, using your skills to do social work, for example, consulting. So this is some one of the things that if you stay in academia, there is a direct path to go, there's a direct path that you could take. But the thing is, and Alea pointed out, like, AI fields recruit a lot of cognitive neuroscientists now. So like people in DeepMind, you can see some of the people who are really pioneers in our fields are also now employed in DeepMind, for example. So if you stay in academia, there's a path that you take. Say, you can take a research route, you can take the teaching route. But if you want to leave academia or whatnot, there's also opportunities that you can use the skills that you've learned and take it with you to do other things.
Probably like in business, like in team building sort of thing. Why people decide, I don't know. Do people go into business? Like,
you can do that, but I'm not sure if it's something that is directly applicable.
Yeah, you do cognitive neuroscience for the passion. Most of us just do it first and then figure out how to solve it later. Yeah. Okay, cool. So there's a question by Jake.
Yeah, that was a question that caught my eye as well.
Yeah,
so you
go
can't
ahead.
do anything from a mistake until you've admitted it as supposed. So there is some evidence that it doesn't have to be conscious as well. In this case, maybe somewhat more admitting mistakes is somewhat more anecdotal, in the sense that, say for example, you tell a person wrong, then they don't want to admit it, and then they won't correct it. There is also some evidence. Not this is in this anecdotal situation. It's more of like, maybe they are personally, they're not willing to admit it to you, but they can correct their mistakes.
Yeah.
But in terms of like awareness of errors, sometimes you can correct, people make adaptations, like slow down, without actually being really conscious about the mistake. So for example, if there's more uncertainty whether there was an error or not, adaptations can still happen. So because a lot of things are not just black and white mistakes, right? There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the thing. But when there's uncertainty, you could begin the process of like correcting the mistake. It's not just when it's you discover that it's a black and white error. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's quite a fair point. So coming on to Scientists of Malaysia. So Jake asks, how do you define a scientist in the context of the Malaysian community? How do you pick your people that you interview, I guess?
Um, we basically we don't want to be exclusive. In the sense that, oh, you have to have a certain qualification or certain training to be featured. It's more of like, if you come into our radar, like we sometimes go on LinkedIn or Facebook or Twitter or just basically Google who works in what field, and sometimes we think about, I personally think, oh, might be interested to interview someone who does computer science, for example. Then I would just go on Twitter or say Malaysian computer scientist. We don't have a particular, we don't want to make it exclusive, but if someone approaches us to say, hey, I got something interesting to share, or like I think I might be relevant, just feel free to contact us. And
yeah, and I think you've also featured, well, engineers as well, right? Because like STEM, it's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So people kind of separate engineering from science, but you also include engineers as well, as a scientist. So I think back to Jake's question, it was more general question. How would you define a scientist? Is it just someone who does research, or someone?
Yeah, we've interviewed people who are not traditionally like scientists as well, but as long as your work is somewhat informed or inspired by like science in the broader term. I mean, engineers definitely fall into the catchment. Yeah. So if you think anything that's relevant, so science is not just about creating the science producing the science. It's also about the uptake of science, like using information from science as well. So
that's a cool point. Yeah, even though you're not a scientist yourself, you can still like use science to, let's say, do a project and stuff. Is it like, what's his name again? The guy that interviewed who made face mask and things like that. That's also science. He's basically like, was it transforming a face mask or trying to make
so it's about 3D
face shield, right?
Yeah. At that point when there's a shortage of PPE materials, and he had some 3D printers on hand, so he created these printed these templates. So these are things that are science informed. I've also interviewed this person who did not have like a PhD in the thing that she was doing, but she was trying to promote awareness of sexual education. So, for example, just increasing public awareness about this thing has got a science behind it, and all that. And she was really nice to hear from. Yeah.
Oh, that's really nice that Scientists of Malaysia is very inclusive. I think that's how we should shift our mentality too. Is that the non-traditional scientists. Cool. So I think we don't really have any other questions, but we'll just end with the question that we always ask everyone on Research Insider. So what's next after your PhD?
I'm keeping an open mind. As you can tell, like academia is somewhat very competitive field. So I'm keeping an open mind. Be quite happy to be teaching as well, like as a university lecturer, probably not high school teacher already. Maybe a bit kids when their cognitive control is a bit more developed. But yeah, I'd be quite happy to do teaching. I've considered it as well. Researching, hopefully. Trying my best to maybe explore a bit more of academia, because I think that there's a lot of things within the field that I want to learn. I'm not quite done with it yet.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Are you thinking of staying here in the UK or balik kampung?
I'm keeping my mind open to it. Like there are circumstances that I need to think about, like family at home and whatnot. So yeah.
All right, good luck, because you're in your third year and you've got another year to go.
Yeah.
Dun, dun, dun.
I'm ramping things up.
Right. Thank you, Josh, for the presentation and your great answers. And thank you to the audience who joined us on a Saturday night. So next week is our last Research Insider session. And our scientist would be Jasmine Erasha, who is doing a master's in climate and society at Columbia University. So that's in New York City. So she's trying to understand and find solutions for climate impacts on the society through a science policy interface. So we'll see you next Saturday for our last session, and be there, because that will be the grand closing of Research Insider. Right, bye. Thanks, guys.